Hello, APUSH students. You got a big test coming up, and I understand that it's a big test, and so therefore, I want to take a few minutes today to help you work your way through your study guide so we make sure we know what to do, what to read, what to review in order to best prepare ourselves for the upcoming Period 6 test. So what I would recommend is that you get out the study guide that's been provided to you in class, and we're going to walk through it relatively quickly, but still make sure we cover everything we need. And as I go through this, you follow along, you jot down what you need to. If there's something you miss, then by all means, go back, review this video again, or better yet, come and talk to me in person if you've got a chance. So let's go ahead and pull up your study guide, and we're going to walk through this really quickly. So remember, this test, Period 6, corresponds to chapters 22 through 26 in your textbook. That's a lot of material, basically the entire Gilded Age. So why don't we walk through that? One of the very first things we talked about was President Grant. President Grant, Ulysses S. Grant, who was elected after the Civil War, after Andrew Johnson went away. This is his first elected position. He was general before that, and he very much governed like a general. That's his leadership style. Give orders, let other people, expect other people to follow them. The problem was that he was pretty hands-off. And in doing so, though he himself was not corrupt, he appointed people who were corrupt to important positions. And that's why his administration is known as one of the more corrupt in history. But as we'll see later, that's not a unique thing during this part of the 19th century. In both 1868 and in 1872, President Grant is elected and then reelected. And in those elections, he most assuredly owes a lot of that victory to the votes of former slaves. Black voters in the South, in particular, this is during Reconstruction, their rights are being protected. They viewed him, much like they viewed Lincoln, as central to victory in the Civil War and emancipation. So he definitely benefits from the votes of former slaves. I mentioned that corruption was not unique to President Grant during this time. Gilded Age politics. Of course, gilded means, it does not mean golded. It means that the outside looks golden, but down beneath, there's a lot of not so good stuff. And in the Gilded Age, one of those things was corruption and inefficiency in politics. In fact, the lifeblood of both the Democratic and the Republican Party was what we call political patronage. Political patronage is when, in exchange for political support, that once a person was elected to office, that person would appoint people, oftentimes undeserving people, to positions, cushy jobs in the government, be that the federal government, the state government, what have you. If an individual gets a lot of votes from me and my party, that individual can expect to be rewarded for their support through political patronage. In fact, that kind of thing happened on both the Democratic and the Republican side. Both of them relied upon it. And the truth is, the two parties are very similar, not just in their use of political patronage, but in terms of the issues that they debate. There aren't a whole lot of important issues that divide the two parties through much of the Gilded Age. Today, we think about Republicans and Democrats disagreeing about a lot of things. That wasn't necessarily true back in those days. There were few significant differences. But there was incredibly high voter turnout, partly because cultural and geographical differences define the two parties, and there was incredible party loyalty back in those days, which is why you see incredible voter turnout, and you see a lot of elections that are very, 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 very close. People in the North voted Republican. People in the South, white Americans in the South, voted Democrat. Big cities had examples, or big cities, excuse me, had Democratic voters in the North. And it's pretty steady throughout the entire Gilded Age. It's a period where both of them, relying upon political patronage, have few significant differences, and have high voter turnout. But the truth is, there's also a lot of corruption. There's corruption at the federal level with the Credit Mobilier scandal, which dealt with kickbacks for railroad construction. Members of Congress get paid off for this. And at a local level is where you see a lot of corruption. In fact, the urban political machine ran rampant. There's no better example of this than Tammany Hall in New York City. Tammany Hall is a New York City Democratic political machine. What do political machines do? They do lots of things, but one of the ways they operated was to provide services for recent immigrants, services that were not provided by the government. And in exchange, those immigrant communities would provide votes for, in this case, the Democratic Party. The political machine decided who would run for office. They would get the votes for them. And then once people got into positions, mayor's offices, city councils, those sort of things, they then would use their influence to direct money back to the political machine. This is called graft. The best example of this is William Boss Tweed. He is the leader, the political boss of Tammany Hall there in New York City, and he kind of controls New York City politics for a long time. In fact, did a lot of illegal and corrupt stuff. It wasn't until actually a political cartoonist by the name of Thomas Nast began to expose a lot of the corruption that Tweed was brought down. So political corruption, political patronage, kind of the coin of the realm of the time. But there are major economic problems at the time. Let's take a look at the Panic of 1873. Remember, a panic is a period, we don't use that term today, but you can think of it as a recession or a depression. What caused the Panic of 1873? Well, part of it was, and a big part of it was, overexpansion of things like railroads, building too many railroads that didn't have enough traffic, digging too many mines that didn't have enough to produce. Overexpansion of railroads and mines and these sort of things led to the Depression, right? We're taking out loans to build railroads, but then the railroads aren't making any money. This leads to the Panic of 1873, this bad depression. What is the result of this? Well, in addition to a major depression, one of the reactions by Congress was to pass the Coinage Act of 73, called by its critics the crime of 73. That is one of the results of the Panic of 1873. What did it do? The Coinage Act of 1873 removed silver as one of the methods of backing up our money. No more coinage of silver, instead relying only on gold. This is something that the bankers preferred, but not necessarily something that the working class folks, the people who are in debt, preferred. This issue of coining silver will become a major issue in the decades to come. It's not the sort of thing that you and I think about as a major political issue, but it most assuredly was at that time. 1876, election of 1876. What's the problem? The problem is we don't know who won, right? In 1876, three southern states, Florida, Louisiana, and South Carolina, sent two sets of electoral returns to Congress to be counted. In other words, there was evidence that either the Democrat or the Republican candidate had won in those. We don't know who actually won. And so Congress puts together a commission to take a look at the returns. What they wind up doing, it appears, is that some sort of a deal was made. We call this the Compromise of 1877. It appears as if the Democrats said to the Republicans, we will give you the presidency. We will award those votes to Rutherford B. Hayes. He can become president, the Republican, in exchange for Hayes removing federal troops from the South. Remember, federal troops had been in the South since the end of the Civil War. We call this Reconstruction. What were they doing? They were protecting the rights of former slaves. So, Compromise of 1877, withdrawal of federal troops from the South. Therefore, in exchange for the presidency, once those troops are removed, Reconstruction is going to be brought to an end. The rights of former slaves are not going to be protected. That means that Democrats are going to be able to retake control of the southern state legislatures, the so-called Redeemers. It's not long after that we begin to see segregation taking place. So how were African Americans disenfranchised following the end of Reconstruction? Lots of ways. We see the creation of things like literacy tests, things like poll taxes, and of course, threats of violence and lynching prevented African Americans from participating freely in the political process. We also see segregation, separating people based upon race. The 14th Amendment says that we have equal protection. What in the South they began to do is said, well, we can provide equality, but we can separate. In fact, it is Plessy versus Ferguson, this most infamous Supreme Court case, that deemed that, quote, separate but equal was in fact constitutional. This has since been overturned, obviously, but in 1876, in Plessy versus Ferguson, the Supreme Court said separate but equal was A-OK. And that allows for the creation of Jim Crow segregation. Jim Crow segregation are the legal codes that allowed for separate facilities for Black and white citizens. Conflict between Black and white citizens are not the only things that are in conflict. There's also conflict through other groups of people, including social classes and other ethnic groups. The National Railroad strike, for example, is a major strike of railroad workers who were protesting wage cuts by all the railroads. How was this put to an end? This was put to an end when President Hayes sends in federal troops to break up the strike. So in other words, the Gilded Age is not a good time for labor unions if they wanted support from the federal government. Anti-Chinese discrimination. Let's talk about this. This is another place where we have conflict. Why did Chinese immigrants come to America in the first place? The first large group of Chinese immigrants came, of course, with the California Gold Rush in 1849. Later, many find work building the Transcontinental Railroad. So first looking for gold, then finding work on Transcontinental Railroad. After the railroad was built, of course, many of these immigrants, thousands of them, stayed to make a new life for themselves in the United States. Unfortunately, because oftentimes they worked in low-wage areas of the economy, other groups of people, other immigrant groups in particular, did not like this and blamed Chinese immigrants for depressing wages and those sort of things. They also, frankly, were discriminatory against them because they were so culturally different than them. And so there's a wave of anti-Chinese violence in the West. How does Congress react to this? Do they step in to protect these people? No, instead, Congress passes the infamous Chinese Exclusion Act, which bars further Chinese immigration to the United States. So not exactly one of our brighter moments. Let's go back to politics for a moment. James A. Garfield. James A. Garfield is elected president in 1880. James A. Garfield was a bit of a reformer, had expressed a desire to change the old political patronage system that perhaps rather than awarding important government jobs to political supporters, maybe it ought to be based upon merits. This is the stalwart half-breed debate that we discussed in class, this debate within the Republican Party. Unfortunately, there was one particular person, Charles Guiteau, who was an insane person, a deranged, disgruntled office seeker who believed he deserved a job because he felt that he had helped get President Garfield elected. He, of course, didn't really play much of a role at all and did not deserve a job. When he did not get it, he decided he was going to assassinate the president. In fact, that's what he did in 1881. He assassinated President Garfield, believing that he was justified because he did not get a job. That's how deep political patronage went. The new president takes over as Chester A. Arthur, a man who actually owed his entire career to political patronage. And the assassination of Garfield convinced Arthur and many others that political patronage had really gone too far and that the system needed to be changed, so-called civil service reform. So the assassination of Garfield convinces President Arthur to support the Pendleton Act. Pendleton Act is the first meaningful bit of civil service reform. It allows for all people who want to take government, about 10% of government employees have to take a competitive exam. In other words, for a percentage of the people who are going to work in the federal government, they had to prove that they were qualified to do this, rather than simply having supported the right candidate. What a noble idea, right? Of course, in 1884, we have another election. Who are the candidates? We've got Grover Cleveland, and we have got James Blaine. No real significant issues divided the two. Instead, the entire election focused on personal attacks and things of that nature. I know we like to think that only recently our politics nasty, but they were back then. Let's talk about Grover Cleveland for a second. Grover Cleveland, known as a veto governor, he didn't believe the government was a force for change or social change or good. And so he kept a very close eye on things like the federal budget, just as he had when he was governor. And so, in fact, he was upset. It seems strange to us today that the government had too much money. There was a surplus. And so what does he do to deal with that? He vetoes it, or he helps lower a tariff to make sure the government didn't have too much money, thinking that that would lead to too much spending. Not something we really worry about today. In 1888, he runs for re-election, and sadly, he loses. So the election of 1888, right here. What should you know? You should know that Benjamin Harrison, that's right, that was a president, is elected president in 1888. The unique part about it, of course, is that Benjamin Harrison loses the popular vote to Cleveland, but he wins the electoral vote. Because you know, here in America, you don't have to get the most votes. You have to get the right votes, right? So in 1888, you need to know that Benjamin Harrison loses the popular vote, but wins the electoral vote. What is there to say about Benjamin Harrison? Not a lot, not a lot. They raised the tariff. It's the president the first time. Congress spends $1 billion. Other than that, not a whole lot. He runs for re-election in 1892, and wouldn't you know it, Cleveland's back. And Cleveland beats him this time. So Grover Cleveland is our first and thus far only president to serve 2 non-consecutive terms. Moving right along. Industrialization. What is the impact of the railroad? The impact of the railroad is twofold. Number one, it opens up the West to settlement. Settlement, conquest of the West would not have been possible had it not been for the railroad. And number two, it allows for the massive industrial growth that takes place over the course of several decades. An industrialized economy needs to be able to move stuff, and the railroad allows that to happen. So let's talk about some of the great robber barons or captains of industry, depending on your perspective, of the era. A few you need to know. First and foremost, we have our friend Andrew Carnegie. Andrew Carnegie, Scottish immigrant, who becomes the wealthiest person in the world at one time by investing in steel. Steel's been around for a long time, but what Carnegie figures out how to do, using something called the Bessemer process, which he didn't develop, but he adapted, is able to mass produce steel. He's mass producing steel at a time where all the bridges are going to become steel. The steel cities are going to be built, railroads. He is controlling a market of something that is going to be used in the construction of everything else. That leads to a lot of wealth. He creates his monopolistic control using something called vertical integration. Let's talk about that real quick. Vertical integration is where one company buys every stage of the process. So in the case of Carnegie, he's not only going to buy the iron ore mines, but he's going to buy the railroads that transport stuff. Then he's going to own the steel factory. He's going to buy every single part of the process, so all the money stays with him. Cornelius Vanderbilt. Cornelius Vanderbilt is someone who starts off in shipping and then moves over to railroads, one of the great railroad titans of the day. J.P. Morgan, if you've heard his name, it's probably because it's on a bank. J.P. Morgan is the great financier, banking person of that time. James Duke. James Duke is the robber baron, the captain of industry for tobacco. And of course, John D. Rockefeller. Rockefeller controls oil. All of these people are controlling elements of the economy that are either very popular, in the case of tobacco, or that are essential to everything else. And that leads to a lot of incredible growth and more money than anyone's ever had. If Carnegie used vertical integration, Rockefeller uses horizontal integration. Horizontal integration is when you buy up all your competitors. So this oil company buys that oil company, buys this oil company, and then forms them all into one big oil company. A lot of the tactics that they use are things that were today we would consider at best unethical, at worst illegal. But many of them justified what they did because of social Darwinism, taking the idea of Charles Darwin's ideas about biology and trying to apply it to human nature. Survival of the fittest is what they would say. Survival of the fittest said that those people who were at the top of society deserved all of their wealth because they're God-given wealth because they were clearly the best equipped to handle it. And so therefore, the only reason why they had all their money is because they were somehow better than everybody else. And so therefore, they were the fittest and they were best equipped to maintain control of society. There were some leaders of industry who did believe in giving back in some ways. In fact, Andrew Carnegie is a believer in the gospel of wealth, the idea that the wealthy have a moral responsibility to give back to society. And so Carnegie's going to give a lot of money, as several of these people are, to things like libraries and universities and things of that nature. There were some efforts made to curtail this tremendous economic concentration among the top. The Sherman Antitrust Act is a big one you need to know. The Sherman Antitrust Act is the first piece of legislation from Congress that tries to outlaw monopolistic behavior, anything that was an illegal restraint of trade, the sort of thing that was designed. Trust is another word for monopoly. So Antitrust Act means it's a law designed to limit monopolistic behavior. And down the road, the Sherman Antitrust Act will, in fact, be used to break up monopolies. Although, ironically, initially, it is first used to break up a lot of labor unions, claiming that they were monopolistic. This is a tough time for labor unions, whether you're talking about the National Labor Union, one of the first attempts at nationalizing all workers, that kind of fell apart in the 1870s. The Knights of Labor, which was the one big union that was open to all who toil. Knights of Labor had big goals of kind of changing the economy. They fall apart following the Haymarket Square riot, where there was an attack during a labor rally, and people associated it fairly or unfairly, most likely, with Knights of Labor, and they kind of fell apart. The one that kind of endures is the American Federation of Labor, the AFL. The AFL, led by Samuel Gompers, rather than kind of these overarching, changing the entire economy sort of things, they focused on short-term tangible things. So things like better working conditions, higher wages, shorter hours, those sort of things that were kind of tangible and measurable. Whereas the other two were really overarching kind of philosophical things. The American Federation of Labor was the most successful. Last Salon focuses on these. So National Labor Union is killed in the 1870s. Knights of Labor, the one big union, falls apart following the Haymarket Square, and then AFL focuses on tangible things like shorter working hours, higher wages. There's lots of workers at this time, and in fact, many of them are coming from other countries. There's a massive amount of immigration during this time, and they're all flooding into cities. Many of them are coming because they're looking for work and jobs are plenty. Others are coming because they're trying to escape persecution and things of that nature. They're all coming into cities primarily, and in those, many times they're facing hostility. So this new group of immigrants were culturally different than older immigrants. Many of them are from Southern and Eastern Europe, and of course, there are some from Asia. So two groups that faced a lot of discrimination in particular. We already mentioned the Chinese. They're the only group who are exclusively targeted and said, you can't come in. Irish immigrants also, primarily because of cultural differences regarding Catholicism, were also targeted, but also folks from Eastern and Southern Europe, like we said. When new immigrants would come in to the cities, there's organizations such as settlement houses, the most famous of which is Hull House under the leadership of Jane Addams. Settlement houses exist to help new immigrants adjust to life in America. But that wasn't the only place that they focused. They focused on things like workplace safety, anti-child labor, and anti-sweatshop, those sort of things as well, is where the Settlement House organization, Jane Addams, also focused. Other Christian leaders, like the ones mentioned here, preached what they called the social gospel. They said in all these cities, there's so much poverty and so much want and desperation that churches actually have a responsibility to address the social issues of the day, not simply focus merely on the spiritual. So the social gospel focuses on addressing poverty, things of that nature. This urbanization also leads to a change in higher education that rather than being funded by churches, Modern American universities during this time got their money from state grants and wealthy contributions from wealthy philanthropists. That's why a lot of the colleges took on the names of people. Stanford, Duke, Vanderbilt. These are all named after people who give a lot of money. Comparing the contrast of views of prominent African-American leaders, Booker T. Washington, W.E.B. Du Bois. This is a big one. You got to know. Both Washington and Du Bois want to improve life for African-Americans in the United States. But the methods they go about doing it are very different. Du Bois, or let's start with Booker T. Washington. Booker T. Washington is born into slavery in the South. And comes in his famous work, Up from Slavery. He talks about how he experienced his life after slavery comes to an end. He advocates for industrial education, making sure that Black Americans have access to education that can be used for economic empowerment. He's not advocating for what we might call higher education. He's not even really challenging segregation, truth be told. Not that he's supportive of it, but he's not directly challenging it. Instead, he focuses on industrial education for African Americans so they can provide for themselves economically. He says that's the most important thing. And so to that end, he creates things like the Tuskegee Institute. One of the main critics of Washington was W.E.B. Du Bois. Du Bois was not born into slavery, was born into the North after the end of the Civil War. He is Harvard educated, has a PhD. And Du Bois says, no, it's not enough to have economic opportunity. African-American voters must demand political and social equality and do so immediately. And in order to obtain that, he advocates for higher education, classical education. He says that a talented tenth of Black men ought to go to the greatest universities in the country and use that to become lawyers and have a seat at the table in Congress and things of that nature in order to directly challenge segregation. This is the place where both of these individuals run into one another. All right, changing from the East out to the West. What were some of the reasons why Indians fought against whites? Well, number one, they took their land, right? They broke treaties. Following the Civil War, as the railroad goes out into the West, that brings an endless supply of white settlement. And the land is being taken from them. And when treaties are signed, more often than not, those treaties are broken by white settlers, by the United States government. A good example of that, why did hostilities begin between the Sioux and the U.S. Army in 1874? Because gold is discovered in the Black Hills, land that was supposed to be set aside for the Sioux Indians. When gold is discovered, white settlers come in, and that leads to conflict. This conflict comes to a head at the Battle of Little Bighorn. Battle of Little Bighorn, also known as Custer's Last Stand, pretty one-sided massacre in which Sioux Indians dominate General Custer and his troops. Following that, there's a massive movement to not pursue peace, as maybe President Grant and others had hoped, but instead round up Native Americans and put them onto reservations. How did they do that? What ultimately led to the defeat? Well, like we said, there's that endless supply of new settlers coming with the railroad, and then the decimation of the buffalo herds, the intentional killing of buffalo, American bison, that were the lifeblood of Native American society. They are nomadic hunters. They rely upon the buffalo. It's much more than just a way of food stuff. It is a way of life. And these buffalo are intentionally killed almost to extinction. When that happens, Native Americans can no longer survive on the plains as the nomadic hunters they once were. There were people, humanitarians, who said, this is wrong what we're doing. The Century of Dishonor is a book at the time that said, the past 100 years, policy toward Native Americans has been wrong and advocated for something different. The problem was it didn't matter if you were a humanitarian, if you were a hardliner, neither side had any respect for Native American culture. And to that end, assimilation becomes the goal. Assimilation, having Native Americans take on the characteristic and culture of white Americans. Two ways this was attempted that you should know of. First was Native American boarding schools, in which children were essentially kidnapped and sent away to boarding schools to be taught the ways of white America. They were not allowed to speak their language, to practice their religion, to use their own names, to communicate with their family. Create an incredible trauma, incredible trauma and abuse that took place over decades. Another way of assimilation was the Dawes Act. The Dawes Act dissolved tribes as legal entities and tried to divide up all the land to give it to Native Americans individually to try to turn them into farmers somehow. What this ultimately results in is a lot of tribal land winding up in the hands of non-Native Americans. Assimilation, both through the tragic boarding schools and through the Dawes Act, ultimately fail and are examples of policies that did a lot of harm at that time. The Indian Wars, as they're known, come to an end in about 1890. The Ghost Dance was a spiritual awakening where Native Americans, desperate to get rid of the white man, to bring back the buffalo, turn to this spiritual awakening, this revival movement, for lack of a better term, to try to do what people throughout the globe, throughout all of history have done, turn to religion as a way of making sense of the troubles of the day. The Ghost Dance, unfortunately, caught the attention of the United States Army, concerned the United States Army, and directly led to an event that really ends tragically the Indian Wars, the Battle of Wounded Knee, which was more of a massacre than anything else, where the United States Army disarmed one last group of Native Americans who were living on the plains and then slaughtered many of them. So the Indian Wars, a tragic series of events that ultimately results in all the land being taken. Why was the land taken by white folks, by the government? Because they wanted it, because they saw the resources out there. The first resource that gets a lot of attention is mining. In fact, it's silver. The largest source of silver that was discovered in the West was in the state of Nevada, the Comstock lode. So mining is the first industry, but then we're going to move on to agriculture and other things. There are a lot of white settlers out there because of the Homestead Act. The Homestead Act, 1862, gave away 160 acres free to any white person who wanted it. Many people took advantage of this, so we're just giving away land, but it had some problems. Number one, the living conditions out west were incredibly difficult, and most of the settlers were unprepared for it and give up. Beyond that, 160 acres, though it sounds like a lot, really was not enough to sustain a farm. And so many people do give up. If a person was given the land, they had to live on it for 5 years and work on it for 5 years in order to get it. Many give up before 5 years is over. But over time, as technology changes, farming does become something you can do in the West. Those first homesteaders didn't have the plows and the harvesters and those sort of things. But as time passes, this new technology allows for changing the Great American Desert into the breadbasket of the world. And the farmers who do go out west, they're not the yeoman farmers that people like Thomas Jefferson imagine. They're not people who are only farming to provide for themselves and maybe sell a little surplus at their local community. Instead, farmers following the Civil War are engaged in cash crop, one large cash crop, be that rye, wheat, corn, whatever it is. In other words, they're farming one thing for the purposes of selling it. But that led to some problems. What was the source of the farmers' troubles in the 1880s? They're selling all this stuff, but in order to be a farmer, they had to go deeply in debt in order to afford tools and the land and the fertilizer and all the things you need are very, very expensive, big capital investments. So they borrowed money from banks. Many of those banks were back east. So they're deeply in debt and they're being charged tremendously high interest rates. Number two, the more productive they were, the more they produced, that drove the prices of those goods further and further and further down. And so no matter how hard they worked, they couldn't make enough to even pay their debt payments. And finally, the railroad is taking advantage of it. If you live in Kansas or Nebraska or the Dakotas and you're a farmer, the only way you can sell your goods is to put it on the railroad, to then ship it back east. But the railroads are able to charge you basically whatever they want. So no matter how hard the farmer was working, no matter how much they were producing, they could never get ahead. They did this most vital thing. They're feeding the nation, and yet all of their money is going to banks, is going to railroads, and the price of their crops are falling. So how and when did they begin to organize? First, they organized with something called the Grange. The National Grange organized as a social organization to kind of help farmers form community. But eventually it and the Farmers Alliance that followed develops into the populist party. Populism, meaning advocating for the economic needs of the working class. The populists, better known as the People's Party, that is their official name, form in the 1880s. In 1890, they run a bunch of candidates for state legislature in Kansas, and they actually take control of the Kansas legislature. The populist movement is growing. So it starts with farmers, the grievances of farmers, and then it begins moving on to other things. What were some of their ideas? In 1892, they're going to run a candidate for President James Weaver. They're not going to win, but they're going to be pretty successful. But in terms of a third party, what were their ideas? Things like, number one, public ownership of things like railroads and telegraphs, things that everybody needed. They reasoned you should not be making money on this. This should be a utility. So public ownership of railroads. They believed in an income tax, that these big corporations and wealthy people ought to have to pay an income tax. A single term for the presidency or term limiting presidencies, things like that. A lot of things that actually down the road in some form will become a reality have their origins in here. So populism starts with the grievances of farmers, turns into the People's Party, and then the ideas spread. One place it spread was to the east, where a guy named Jacob Coxey, in response to a panic in 1893, there's a terrible depression. Coxey forms what he calls an army of people, the first ever march on Washington to go to Washington, D.C. and say to the government, do something, provide jobs by creating public works, hire the millions of people who are unemployed following the panic of 1893. Does he get what he wants? No, he does not. In fact, when his army shows up, they are arrested for trespassing and things like that, walking on the grass, this sort of nonsense. What this represents is there is a change happening. People in the country are looking at the economics of the Gilded Age, and they're beginning to expect more from their government. But the government had not yet changed. And so we're seeing tension exist where there is this groundswell of calls for reform, the government not being responsive to it. And that's represented by Coxey. In 1896, we have a presidential election, and this is one of the more famous elections in history. This is the first time that we see a real difference between the two political parties. The Republican candidate is William McKinley, big business Republican. But the Democratic candidate is a young person who's still in his 30s, named William Jennings Bryan. William Jennings Bryan is the Democratic nominee, and the Democrats are going to take on many of the issues that the Populist Party supported. Most importantly, the most important issue is the coinage of silver. Remember earlier, a long time ago now, we talked about the crime of 73. The populists believed in the coinage of silver to create inflationary policy to allow more people to get their hands on currency. The Democrats under Bryan will embrace that in 1896. And so what role did the populists play? They endorse Bryan, the Democrat. They do not run a candidate. So the Republican candidate is William McKinley. The Democratic candidate is William Jennings Bryan, and the populists support Bryan. It is a campaign where Bryan goes from town to town, giving fiery speeches, advocating for the working class people, populism. William McKinley stays on his front porch and advocates for the needs of big business. And in the end of the day, big business wins. Big business wins. William Jennings Bryan is unable to win. All right, folks, I know that was a lot. That was a lot. But if you followed along and you, to the best of your ability, filled out the things that we have here on your study guide, I think you'll be well prepared. So if there's anything you missed, go back and watch it. If there's any questions you have, if you have the opportunity, come and see me. Period 6, chapters 22 through 26. It's a lot, but you are going to do great.